Hello folks, and welcome to part 2 of our histology lecture. Now where we left off, we were in the middle of talking about epithelial tissues. We had in fact just finished our discussion of the various classifications of epithelial tissues and had started to discuss glandular epithelia. Now glandular epithelia can be classified using two different systems. The first focuses on how secretions from the glands actually move through the body. Okay? Exocrine glands excrete secretions onto an epithelial surface. So think of X as meaning exit. Okay? Secretions leave this gland, like you see in the diagram down here on the left. They leave the gland and are excreted onto an epithelial surface, either inside of a duct or onto the surface of the body or into the hollow space, the lumen of an organ like the stomach or the intestines. Now in contrast, endocrine glands release their secretions inside the bloodstream, endo meaning inside. So think of this as being more contained. If you look at the diagram down here on the right, this is what endocrine secretion looks like. You have endocrine cells that occur alongside blood vessels and release their product into the blood vessel. Like so. So all these little white dots you see here in the diagram are secretions from that endocrine tissue. And those secretions then are distributed to the rest of the body via the bloodstream. Right? So those are your different classes of secretion movement. Either secretions are released onto the surface, an epithelial surface, or they're released into the bloodstream itself. Now the other way that we can classify glands is how secretions are actually released from the gland itself. If we focus on the way that glandular secretions are released, now if you focus on the way that secretions are actually released from a gland, you'll note that there are 3 different mechanisms that glands can use to actually deliver their products to the body. Those 3 are called apocrine, merocrine, and holocrine styles of secretion. And we're going to take a look at all 3. We're going to start at the top here with merocrine. All right. This image is showing you what the salivary glands in the back of your mouth look like. These are merocrine glands. Now the way merocrine glands work is, if you look at the cells over here on the right, here's one individual cell. Secretory vesicles, which we're familiar with now, are released from the Golgi apparatus and sent to the cell membrane, where they are then released out into the body. For example, into the open space inside your mouth. Now note that the merocrine cells themselves are not harmed or structurally changed in any way by this process. They're simply using their built-in manufacturing apparatus here in the endoplasmic reticulum and then the Golgi apparatus to create these secretory products and then to send them out of the cell via normal exocytosis. Remember, that's one of our cell transport mechanisms that we discussed before. The next thing we're going to do is compare merocrine secretion to our second type of secretion, which is called apocrine secretion. Oops. Okay. It's in our second example down here. Okay. Now in apocrine secretion, the materials being secreted, the products, are gathered in the top portion of the cell called the apical portion of the cell. That apical portion of the cell is then separated from the rest of the cell and released. It breaks down, and the secretory products are released into the body as that top portion of the cell dissolves and disintegrates. Meanwhile, the bottom part of the cell regrows a new top, filling it with all new product, until eventually it breaks off that new top portion of the cell again, and once again that now broken down, dissolving portion of the cell releases its products out to the rest of the body, okay? Or to wherever those products are destined. Mammary glands are a great example of apocrine glands, right? The milk that we feed to our newborns is concentrated in the tops of these apocrine cells in the mammary gland. And when the tops of those cells break free, they deliver their load of milk and nutrients to the baby as that baby is nursing. Now, again, the original cell survives. Okay? Just like in merocrine secretion, the original cell isn't destroyed and it doesn't die. Right? Our last mode of secretion is called holocrine secretion, and it's down here at the bottom. Right? Now, holocrine secretion differs from both apocrine and merocrine secretion in that holocrine cells do not survive. Holocrine cells themselves become part of the secretory product, meaning they blow up and cease to exist once they're done with their job. Okay? So usually in holocrine glandular tissue, you have a layer of cells that's giving rise to new cells. All right, we call these stem cells. They're going to generate layer after layer of new replacement cells. As those replacement cells mature, they increase in size, okay, and start filling with secretion product. Eventually, these cells will be pushed to the top layer, and once they arrive there, they will burst, which releases their contents, releases their cytoplasm, which includes the secretions that the cells are supposed to be releasing in the first place, right? So the way that these secretions are actually liberated from the cell is by the cell blowing up, killing itself, in order to let loose all of this product that it's been creating. So just to be clear, during merocrine secretion, the original cells, the glandular cells, survive. Right? During apocrine secretion, same thing. The original cells, the glandular cells, also survive. They just lose their apical surface, their topmost surface. But in holocrine secretion, the cell dies. Right? When it actually releases its product, the cell itself is killed during the process. And that's a big difference between holocrine secretion and the other two types of glandular secretion. Our next tissue category is connective tissue. There are some distinguishing features of connective tissue that you need to know. The biggest difference between connective tissues and epithelial tissues is that cells in connective tissue are widely spaced apart. Remember, our epithelial cells, if we go back, we're right on top of each other. There's no gaps in between them. They are right next to each other. That's not going to be the case here with connective tissue. If I scan ahead, as an example, you can see that we have individual cells here in this diagram, but there's a whole bunch of empty space surrounding them. That's much more typical of connective tissue. Now, in the spaces between the cells, you find what's called extracellular material. Extra means outside, and cellular, not surprisingly, means cell. So this is support material located outside and between your connective tissue cells. This material is referred to as matrix. You always have cells embedded in a matrix. When you're looking at connective tissue. Right? That's one way to identify it as opposed to epithelial or muscular tissue. Now there's 3 subcategories to connective tissue, and each of these subcategories has 2 sub-subcategories, if you will. The first connective tissue category is just sometimes referred to as connective tissue proper or true connective tissue. And there's 2 different types of connective tissue proper. There is loose connective tissue, which is distinguished by the fact that there are fibers in this tissues that create a loose open framework or scaffold, okay, like a loosely woven fabric. Now that's opposed to dense connective tissue, which is where fibers, very similar to the ones in loose tissue, are densely packed together. So it's the difference between having fibers woven together like this versus fibers that are woven together like this. Okay. Our next type of connective tissue is fluid connective tissue, which literally are fluids in your body. The 2 primary ones are blood and lymph. We'll go into a lot of detail on these 2 connective tissues when we do our circulatory and immunity unit later in the semester. But know that blood is contained in the cardiovascular system, that's the heart and all of its associated blood vessels, while lymph is contained in a closely related lymphoid system. Now both of these systems are made up of vessels, which are tubes that contain the fluid. Okay. Finally, we've got supporting connective tissue. This is tissue like cartilage and bone, which helps to bear the weight of the body and cushion points of impact like your joints. Cartilage has a very solid but rubbery matrix between the cells. Bone, on the other hand, has a solid crystalline matrix between the cells. Cartilage tends to be more flexible than bone because of this difference in the matrix materials. All right, let's start with loose fibrous connective tissue. This is sometimes called areolar tissue. I've also heard it pronounced areolar. Areolar seems to be the more common pronunciation in the US, though. Okay. Now this areolar tissue, or loose connective tissue, is found in places where you need to have 2 other structures connected to each other, but those 2 structures have to be able to move a little bit against each other as well. The easiest thing for me to picture when it comes to loose fibrous connective tissue is how the skin is anchored to muscle underneath the dermis, which is the lowest level of the skin. Imagine how mobile your skin has to be. You've got to be able to slide your skin around on the underlying muscle in order for it to stretch and accommodate the bending and movement of your joints. So if you just put your hand on your skin, say of your arm, and shift it, you can feel that it slides around. Now your skin is still anchored to the underlying muscle, but it's anchored using this loose connective tissue that allows it to have a little bit of give. You see this in the digestive tract as well. You need your stomach and intestines to be able to move, but you don't want them flopping around loose in your abdomen. You want them to be anchored in place. Using loose connective tissue allows them to stretch and expand, but still keeps them in roughly the right location. Same thing with your respiratory system, like your lungs, which need to be able to expand and also contract, which means they have to be anchored in place, but with the flexibility to move. Right? Urinary tract is the same. Muscles that have to be able to contract against each other, blood vessels that have to expand and contract, also other things like nerves, and also joints where there has to be motion and mobility. Anywhere where you need structures to be stuck together but able to move against each other, that's where you find areolar tissue. Okay? Look at the structure of this tissue. You have your cells here, interspersed with two different types of fibers. There are these larger, thicker fibers, which are made of collagen. Collagen is a protein. It is fairly robust, meaning it's pretty tough, has very little elasticity to it. It's mostly used for structure and support. Doesn't have a lot of stretch. But then do you see these darker lines here? These black lines running through this diagram? Those are elastic fibers. Those do have a lot of stretch, and that's what gives this tissue its ability to expand and contract as the structures that are connected to it have to expand and contract. Now, the collagen fibers and the elastic fibers make up the matrix. Okay, so this is what's filling the space between your living cells. Okay. Your living cells are here, fibroblasts. These are the cells that actually give rise to new elastic and collagenous fibers. Okay, so those living cells are going to create more of their own matrix. Now, some functions of loose connective tissue, of areolar tissue: cushioning of organs, okay, providing a nice buffer against shock. They provide support but permits independent movement. Okay. There are also some immune functions of this tissue type, but we're not going to talk about those yet, so don't worry about that yet. Next up, we have our dense fibrous connective tissue. Now, just at a glance, you can see the difference. Look at how much white space there is on our areolar tissue compared to how little white space there is on our dense fibrous tissue. Okay? You find dense fibrous connective tissue where you need firm attachment. Okay? It conducts the pull of muscles, meaning it makes up the structures that anchor muscles to bone, structures we call tendons. All right? So this is the connective tissue between muscle and bone. It's also the connective tissue found between bone and bone, so connecting bones to each other. These are called ligaments. You find this covering skeletal muscles as well and forming the capsules of internal organs, which provide protection for the organ. Okay. If you need firm attachment and firm support, you use dense fibrous connective tissues. Now look at the composition of this tissue. You've still got your fibroblasts, your cells that are going to make new fibers. These are your living cells. All of the pink stuff in this diagram is the matrix, and it is only made up of collagen fibers. They're inelastic and they're tough. And notice there are a lot of them woven together very, very tightly. That's what gives this connective tissue its immense strength. Next up, a connective tissue that surprises people sometimes, adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat-storing tissue. It's located deep to the skin, meaning just under the skin, and is especially prevalent at the sides of the abdomen, on the buttocks, around the breasts in both men and women. It's also present as padding around the eyes and, interestingly, around your kidneys. Okay. It provides a lot of cushioning in those locations and helps to insulate against shock. It also helps to literally insulate, meaning it reduces your heat loss, helps to maintain a steady body temperature thanks to homeostasis. Probably most famously, though, the fat in adipose tissue is used as an energy reserve. And you can see just how much fat is in this tissue by looking at its structure. These cells are adipocytes. Adipocytes are fat cells. Adipose literally means fat. The little dots here, those are the nuclei. The rest of these cells, this big yellow blob in the diagram on the left, these open white spaces in the picture on the right, those are all filled with fat. That's where your fat gets stored. Right. The next group of connective tissues are the cartilages. There's a number of them, and you need to be able to tell them apart. The first pair that we're going to compare are hyaline and elastic cartilages. Okay, they're the easiest to confuse. Now first, just look at the structure of the cartilages. Hyaline is very empty. There's lots of open spaces where there aren't any cells and there aren't any fibers. It sort of looks to me like these cells are almost floating on a pink background, especially if you look at the actual photo over here. There's sort of this big watery pink background with these very obvious cell clusters floating on it. That's how you identify hyaline cartilage. Now that pink background, all of this open space, that's actually matrix. Okay? In that cartilaginous matrix, that non-living matrix, you have your living cells, which are called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are cartilage cells. And these cartilage cells are the little white circles here, but notice they're surrounded by sort of this darker background in these little spheres. This dark background is actually empty space. The matrix here is solid, absolutely rock solid. Or, I'm sorry, not rock solid, it's dense, densely filled with cartilage material, which is rubbery in texture. But this dark area that surrounds all of these little white cells, that's literally empty space. It's an open spot in the matrix where the chondrocytes live, and they're called lacuna. These are open spaces where chondrocytes are found. Think of them as almost like caves that the chondrocytes live inside of. Okay? Now, hyaline cartilage you find in a couple very specific places. Okay? You find it anywhere you need stiff but still somewhat flexible support. Right? Think about the tip where the tips of your ribs meet the bones of your sternum. Your ribs rub up against your sternum, okay? And they need to be kept apart from each other because when bone contacts bone, it can grind. So these cartilage pads between your ribs and your sternum are rigid. They keep the two bones apart, but they also allow a little bit of give so that ribs and sternum can expand and move as you breathe. You also find hyaline cartilage covering the bone surfaces at joints. Think like your knee, your elbow, anywhere bones are going to rub against each other in a joint. You have pads of hyaline cartilage that help to keep them separated from each other. It creates cushioning. You also find hyaline cartilage surrounding your larynx, which is your voice box in your throat, and also your trachea, which is the tube that connects your mouth to your lungs. You don't ever want your trachea to collapse because then you'll suffocate. Having it made out of this stiff cartilage helps to ensure it stays open. Okay? It also forms part of your nasal septum, which is the section of your nose that separates your two nostrils, right? Kind of towards the tip of your nose. If you wiggle the tip of your nose back and forth, you'll feel a little section of cartilage along the top edge of your nose, right at the tip. It wiggles, it moves, but it's pretty stiff too. You wouldn't want to bend it too far. Okay? You get stiff and flexible support from this stuff. You also get a reduction of friction between bony surfaces when you find it located at joints. Okay? It keeps the bones from rubbing on each other. Now compare that to elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage, as you can see in the picture, is made up of a whole lot of fibers. There's all these fibers in the matrix separating our chondrocytes and their lacuna from each other. These are elastic fibers, and elasticity means stretch. Right? This is where you use elastic cartilage where you need a structural support, but a structural support that can be stretched and distorted without permanent damage, and one that can return to its original shape. The ear is the best example. The auricle of your external ear is this upper part of your ear. You can bend it. If you reach up and bend the upper portion of your ear, you can feel that it bends and flexes, but when you let it go, it pops back to its original shape. That is typical of elastic cartilage. You find this in places of the body that are commonly deformed or under pressure. If you sleep on your side, you know your ear gets pushed into your pillow at night. And those are parts of your body that need structure, but also need to be able to bend under that pressure and then regain their original form when the pressure is gone. Okay, that's where you find elastic cartilage. Notice that hyaline cartilage does not have fibers in its matrix. Elastic cartilage does. It's an easy way to tell them apart. Next up is fibrous cartilage. Fibrous cartilage to me looks like water. Little waves on the ocean or waves on the surface of a creek or a river. Occasionally with a giant eyeball floating in it. That's what that looks like to me. That eyeball structure is actually your chondrocyte in your lacuna. The chondrocyte is the blue circle here with the nucleus in the middle, and then the lacuna is this white space around it. It's the same idea. The lacuna is like the cave or the open space that the chondrocyte lives inside of. Now, all of these waves that you see that look like ripples on water, those are collagen fibers woven tightly together in the matrix. Remember, collagen does not like to stretch. It does not have a lot of give to it. Fibrous cartilage is very rigid. It resists compression, meaning you can't flatten it out. You find it in places where two structures come together under pressure in the body. Think between bones, like the cartilage pads between your vertebra. There are fibrous cartilage pads within your knee joint, between the pubic bones of your pelvis as well, where your pelvis comes together in the front of your body. There's actually a little pad of fibrous cartilage that keeps the two sides of the pelvis from crashing into each other. Where you need a reduction in friction and cushioning that cannot be crushed under pressure, that's where you're going to use fibrous cartilage. Next up, we have bone, also just called osseous tissue. Osseous just means bone. Okay. Now, bone to me under a microscope always looks like a tree ring or like a section of a tree trunk. Okay. What you're seeing here is actually the structure of a bone that has been transversely sectioned. Okay, so let me see if I can draw a decent looking bone here. Okay. All right, that's kind of a terrible drawing, but you get the idea. Pretend that's a femur. If you were to cut that femur like so, and then look at one end, edge on, you would see this, a transverse section, and it would look like what you see here in this picture. Okay? So this would be the middle of the long bone. This is going out towards the edges of the bone. Okay? Now, in the middle of the bone, what you see here in the center is called the central canal. And inside the central canal are your blood vessels and things like nerves that have to run through the entirety of the bone. Now, those blood vessels are there to deliver things like oxygen and nutrients to the living cells in the bone. Because remember, bone is a living tissue. There are live cells in your hardened bones. They're called osteocytes, and they also exist inside of lacunae, just like the chondrocytes do. On this microscopic image, the osteocytes inside their lacuna just look like dark dots. Okay, it's hard to tell where the osteocyte ends and the lacuna begins. Same thing on this drawing over here, right? Now, those cells have to be able to talk to each other. The osteocytes have to be able to send messages to one another. They've got to be able to receive nutrients and oxygen and to get rid of waste products like CO2, which means they have to have canals between them, little tunnels that connect them both to each other and to this central canal in the middle, which is where all their nutrients and oxygen are coming from. Those little canals are called canaliculi. Canal is right there in the word. It's these tiny little lines that you see. On the drawn diagram on the right, they're these little black lines. On the actual picture, the microscopic image on the left, they're very, very faint, but you can still see them. They're the dark lines inside of those circles I drew. They're almost hair-like. They're so fine. Right? Those canaliculi connect the osteocytes to each other, and they connect all the osteocytes back to the central canal. Now remember, bone is still connective tissue, which means living cells are embedded in a non-living matrix. The matrix is the calcium carbonate bone itself that you see here. Everything in between your living cells is matrix. The rigid part of a bone, the hard part that we interact with, is the matrix of that bone. All right, next up, we have blood, one of our two fluid connective tissues. Blood is pretty distinctive under the microscope. It looks like a whole bunch of red cells, okay? That's really what you see primarily in a blood sample, are the red blood cells, also called erythrocytes. We'll learn that word when we actually do the circulatory unit. These red circles are the red blood cells. You will occasionally see white blood cells as well. They are larger and tend to show up more as a purplish blue in color under the scope. You'll also see little dots, little dark dots there and there. They're over here as well, even some that haven't been circled for you yet. There they are. These are called platelets, and platelets participate in clotting. So whenever you need to form a blood clot because you've been injured and you're losing blood, platelets come in and help that clot form. Red blood cells help to transport oxygen. That's their major job. Transport oxygen. And white blood cells participate in your immune response. The matrix for blood is a fluid called plasma. That's the matrix here, the non-living stuff that separates your living cells. We'll talk about what that plasma is made of later. For now, know that it's mostly water. All right, next category of tissues are muscle tissues. All muscle tissues have two characteristics in common. The first is that muscle tissue is conductive. Now, this is unique for tissues so far. Muscle tissue is one of only two types of tissue that can conduct electrical impulses. The other kind is nervous tissue. Okay? Muscle tissue is also contractile, meaning that it can contract. Or another way to think about that is it can shrink in size. That is unique to muscle tissue. Muscle is the only tissue that can do this. Epithelial can't do it, neither can connective, neither can nervous. This is unique to muscles. And it's how muscles are able to generate movement and move the body around. Now there's three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. What you'll find is that skeletal and smooth are very easy to tell apart. Cardiac, though, winds up having characteristics of both skeletal and smooth and can be a little harder to identify, but I'll show you how. We'll start with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells are long, cylindrical, striated, and multinucleate. Now that's a mouthful. First off, take a look at the diagram on the left. This is a single cell. Okay? So notice it is cylindrical in shape, meaning it's shaped like a cylinder, like a long tube. It's also very long in length, and it has these lines on it. These are called striations. All right? These striations are why we say it's striated. It almost looks striped. Also, notice this single cell here has not one, but two nuclei. Okay? Multinucleate means there's more than one nucleus per cell. Skeletal cells, skeletal muscle cells, can have 2, 3, sometimes 4 nuclei. All right? That is something very distinctive. Notice where the nuclei are located. We'll revisit this again later as well. Notice they're shoved along the edge of the cell. They're not out here in the middle somewhere. They're stuffed along the edge. That's another very distinctive trait. The nuclei on these cells are shoved to the edge of each cell. Now, skeletal muscle is also what we call voluntary. Voluntary muscle is muscle that you choose when to move. You make a decision when you want skeletal muscle to actually activate and do something. Think about the muscles that are connected to your bones. Things like your arm muscles or your leg muscles or your abdomen or even your facial muscles. These are muscles you can control the activity of, and you decide when they contract and when they relax. That is unique to skeletal muscle. This is our only voluntary muscle. Our other muscle types are going to be beyond our conscious control. Let's look at smooth muscle next. Okay. Smooth muscle cells are very short, not long like skeletal. They also tend to be spindle-shaped, which means they are wide in the middle, but narrow at both ends. Okay. And your nucleus would be in the center. That's spindle-shaped. They're also non-striated. Look at how smooth this muscle looks. Ah, get it? It's smooth looking, not striped. That's where it gets its name from. Also, each cell has a single central nucleus, just one nucleus per cell. That's another difference between smooth and skeletal muscle. Okay. So notice the muscle itself also just has a smoother outline. The lines are smoother, the cells line up next to each other somewhat fluidly. It just has a smoother appearance overall. That's why it has the name. Now, smooth muscle is involuntary. Involuntary, in means without, means we don't have conscious control over this muscle. These are the muscles found in places like our digestive tract, where we want our digestive organs to automatically move things like food and urine through our digestive tract and out of our body. We don't want to have to consciously think about that process to control it. It happens automatically. Okay? Same thing with things like breathing. The muscles that help regulate our breathing are also involuntary. They operate on their own without us having to think about them. Now finally, we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle tissue can be confusing because it has a mix of characteristics that both skeletal and smooth muscle also have. So like smooth muscle, the cells in cardiac muscle are short. But like skeletal muscle, they're striated. Okay? But like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle has a single nucleus per cell. Okay? You see how you get a mix of characteristics here? You have the striations like we saw in skeletal muscle, these nice little stripes. But we also have just the single nucleus per cell, which we saw in smooth muscle. When you look at the image of cardiac muscle too, it also to me tends to look a little smoother, a little bit cleaner, like our smooth muscle did, unlike our skeletal muscle, which was very different in appearance. Okay? So cardiac muscle tends to have this more liquid appearance, which can be confusing. Now there are two things that are unique to cardiac muscle, completely unique. The first is that the cells are branched. Look at the drawn diagram down here. This cell ends right here. It has one branch that ends here and a separate branch that ends there. Okay. Same thing here. This cell ends here. It has one branch that ends there and another branch that comes way up here. Okay. So these multiple branches on single cells are a very distinctive characteristic of cardiac muscle tissue. The cells themselves are shaped like branches on a tree. Okay? Kind of like that. Right? And the nucleus can be anywhere in that cell. It could be there in the middle. It could just be shoved up in one of the branches too. Now, there's another distinctive feature of this tissue type. Look at where the cells come together. There are these very obvious lines that demarcate one cell from another. Okay, it's even here in the photo of the actual cells and tissue. These are called intercalated discs, and they're only found in cardiac tissue. That's probably the easiest way to identify this tissue as being different from the others. You have these obvious bands, these discs that separate the cells from each other. Okay. Now, like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle is also involuntary. You don't have to think about it to make sure your heart beats. Remember, cardiac tissue, cardiac means heart. That's the only place you find this tissue, is in the heart. All right, last group of tissues, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is also conductive, just like muscle. Muscle tissue is also conductive, meaning they can conduct electrical impulses to transmit information or commands. Now, nervous tissue is composed of two different types of cells. Neurons are probably the most famous. Okay? They've got this really distinctive appearance with a cell body where the nucleus is located and the majority of the cytoplasm. And then branching off that cell body are all of these structures, which are called dendrites. Okay? The dendrites are these short guys that are connected straight to the cell body, and there's many of them. You also, though, have another extension off the cell body here. It's called an axon. Okay? The axons, generally, there's only one, and it's long, while the dendrites are short and branched. Okay? Now, neurons are the cells that generate and conduct, or another way to think of this is they transmit those electrical impulses I was talking about. They're generating and passing along that electrical information. But these neurons need a lot of support. Okay? They need a lot of upkeep. So there's a whole other class of cells called neuroglial cells. Neuroglial cells provide anatomical and functional support to the neurons. Think anatomical as being structure. They help hold them in place. And functional being just that, function. Think physiological support, meaning they help maintain the environment the neurons are living in so the neurons stay healthy and cared for. Now, you find nervous tissue scattered throughout the body, but the highest concentration of it is in the brain and the spinal cord. All right, that's it for our tissues lecture. Make sure that you study these slides and you work through the tissue identification portion of the lab manual. You will have to identify images of these tissues and their structures on the exam, as well as identify the functions of the tissues in general, what they do. All right, I'll see you soon.